So my name is Acacia. I'm the Statewide Employment First Coordinator, which is really a fancy name for my job is to help people with intellectual or developmental disabilities who want to go to work in the community, go to work in the community. So that means that we help them, for people who've been in a traditional sheltered workshop or facility-based employment where they only worked with people with disabilities, typically produced a product, often we're paid less than minimum wage. It's a big transition to work in a community job. So a grocery store, we have people who work at colleges. We've got folks working all over the state of Oregon at Nike, state government, which is really remarkable, but it is a really big change. It's a change for them, it's a change for their families, it's a change for their providers who are very used to providing services in a routine-oriented way. And so we've really just kind of taken all of the pieces of the supports in Oregon, put them in a bag, shook them up and dumped them out. And now we're just trying to put them back together in a way that makes sense. I think Oregon has always wanted to be a leader in terms of developmental disability services. We had self-determination very early, and that means people were able to hire their own staff to work with them, to choose the type of services they wanted. In 2008 was when it really became, well, it was a little bit earlier than that, it was a national movement, but Oregon signed on early in 2008 and said we want to prioritize competitive integrated employment. In 2012, there was a federal lawsuit with Centers for Public Representation, Department of Justice, and most importantly, we had named plaintiffs, people who said, I've wanted to work, I haven't been able to work, you need to help me have the supports, I need to go to work. So that spurred an executive order, 2 executive orders, a settlement agreement, and the really nice thing about it is it happened at the same time that the federal legislation changed. So we saw the home and community-based services regulation for DD services change, the WIOA, I don't even know if I can handle that acronym. WIOA.
Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act.
Thank you. I always get it a little bit wrong. And that pointed towards competitive integrated. Everything basically said we're going in the direction of competitive integrated employment. And so we wanted to make sure that we did it in a way that would make sense. So we were lucky in a lot of ways because we'd had legislation within our state as well as executive orders and some pressure from lawsuits to say we need to put resource here. So we had resource for providers to transform. We had resource for, I have a team of people working in Oregon on employment. Most states I talk to, they have one person. And it gave us resource to reach out to businesses, families. So we wanted it to be thoughtful, but we're lucky in the sense that all of the pieces and arrows pointed the same way and that we knew we needed to really change our system so that we could get there. We get a lot of pushback from families, sometimes self-advocates who've been in the sheltered workshop a long time. In Oregon, we created sheltered workshops, and a lot of states do this to help transition from the institution. So people who'd lived in institutional care, when we closed that in the 90s, they would move into maybe their own apartment or into smaller group homes. But one of the things is that we wanted them to have work, not at the institution. So we created sheltered workshops, not really understanding the long-term effect of that. But the challenge with that is some people transition from an institution, they had the sheltered workshop, they've been there for 30 years, and now we are asking them to transition again. And so we get concern about safety. Will my kid be safe, or will my friend be safe in the community? We get concerns about just, transitioning. Somebody's worked a long time, and what other services could they do? Sheltered workshops aren't just places, in my experience, where people go to work. That's also where they would have maybe social interaction, or that's their schedule. And so people wanted to know that they could still do that. So if they couldn't go to the sheltered workshop and they wanted to get a job for 10 hours, they'd been in the sheltered workshop for 20, what did the other 10 hours, what would they do? So we made sure that we had community services where people could go out on their own in the community or have time with friends to help fill that gap. People volunteered. A lot of folks wanted to retire, and they wanted to have meaningful retirement. So we helped them plan, what would anybody's life look like in retirement? If you were going to volunteer somewhere, how do we provide that support? So that's been, there's fear for safety. There's fear for just having full days and whole lives. And so we're still facing those concerns and trying to address them. I was just talking to Joe. One of the questions I asked was about wage. His son Tad made 10 cents an hour in the sheltered workshop and 11 plus in a community job. But for Tad, money's not necessarily what his motivation to work is. He likes to be out in the community. He's making friends. His life is changing in a positive way. Sometimes I'll kind of hear that as an excuse. Well, this person doesn't understand the value of money, but that doesn't mean that they don't understand the value of work, because that's where we all go to make friends, to, contribute to society, find value in ourselves.
Tad is a 45-year-old man. He has multiple developmental disabilities since birth, which would include cerebral palsy, cognitive disabilities, some seizure activity that continue, and non-ambulatory, non-verbal, and so it kind of puts him into, say, one end of the spectrum for our individuals with DD. And my response has been that Tad shows us the things that he wants to do. He does not, he communicates at a very low level with gestures. His sounds are not normally intended for normal communication for him. He indicates that he likes to get out of the house. He doesn't like to stay at home all the time. He likes to be involved in the community, and he has individuals that help him do shopping and just getting out, maybe going bowling and those kind of things. And it just from that we have essentially deduced that work is a perfect thing for our son Tad. It's another good question. It's like we ask ourselves, well, what's the benefit going to be? And Tad, he gets up and he's ready to go to work. It seems like every day that he's scheduled for it. He doesn't work every day, but he works 3 days a week. He's more eager to get going in the mornings. He likes being out, and this is just one more way for him to be out. But I think he's enjoyed being involved with people, meeting new friends, and he kind of learned that it's going to be 2 or 3 hours that he gets to do this on the days that he works, and so I think it's just through his actions that we conclude that he does enjoy work, and it's a success for him. Tad worked at Lilo's Hawaiian Barbecue. It's in one of our main town in our community. Is a rural area, about 15,000 people, so there's not a lot of options for jobs. And in this case, the Lilo's, managed by a man named Jose Ruiz, was looking to start a delivery service. And he decided that Tad would be a good fit for that, and it seemed to be also, from Tad's perspective, a good fit because he'd be traveling and interacting at different places. But the answer is at Lilo's Hawaiian Barbecue, delivering lunches.
What kind of supports does Tad have on the job?
Okay, Tad is an individual that requires a great deal of support. He has what you would call a one-on-one attendant care person to make sure that if he has any behavior issues or any hygiene issues or anything like that, that they can be taken care of while he's out in the community. And also, again, I mentioned behavior, so it's really good that we have that kind of help. He also has what would be referred to as a job coach, which can kind of help Tad through the steps of this lunch delivery. And when I say delivery, we really like to see Tad actually hand the lunches to the individual that purchased them. It seems to get him a lot of interaction with people that way. It's become apparent to me that more people know Tad than know me in our community, and it's from this community involvement in addition to the employment. We've since closing our sheltered workshop and getting individuals like Tad more out into the community, I think he's became a lot more at ease, less issues with behavioral issues, for instance, and it's allowed him to meet people that do wind up being his friend. They look for Tad, they greet him, and he greets them, and they let me know that when we're in town. People say, "Hey, I saw Tad the other day, and he was in Kmart doing some shopping." This whole process is a long transition. Tad's, I mentioned, he's 45 years old. So as we've gone through 4 decades of him going through different steps from early childhood up to education, and then to a local support provider, starting in Oregon in 1997 was when he first got into this, and the options there were sheltered workshop activities, but at least it was a chance for him to be with his peers, and you know, an individual with disabilities like Tad presents a great deal of confusion on the parents' part as to wondering, you know, what his future is going to be like. So I think as a family, we were willing to accept that, you know, maybe this is a good alternative for Tad. But it was very confining. I mean, not being out in the community and not seeing different people, and it was apparent, I think, after a while that Tad needed more. He needs to be away from home, for one. We know that. He gets very uncomfortable if he's at home long enough to, like 3 days, he starts getting pretty hard to deal with, hard to be around, I'll put it that way. He wants to get out. So we know that then this change that came about with the support facility, I think, I think I'm getting to the answer to the question here, and that's basically that it took us those 40 years to realize that Tad needed more than being involved just with his peers and being in a sheltered workshop or staying at home. He needed to be able to get out and enjoy the community. It took us a long time to think that he could actually do it. Okay, to accept that our son was going to be capable of moving through that process and into the next phase. And so finally, I think his mother and I have some sense of a really good feeling that Tad has a future. It's really important to understand how Tad and his friends actually worked in that environment. I guess a lot of the work was sorting objects, maybe shredding paper, and packing items that maybe some contractor was interested in marketing. So it was certainly meaningful work. The pay rates for what's referred to as subminimal is normally relies upon a method of determining some productivity rate and somehow equating that to some value. And in this case, for Tad working in the workshop, and he worked there, you have to understand, for over 15 years, off and on. And his rate, as I recall, never exceeded 10 cents an hour, which implied, with depending on the number of hours, but his bi-monthly paycheck would never exceed, or not that I recall, over $1. And so that's, to me, that's what's meant by subminimal wage, and it still exists in a lot of places around this country, and I'm glad that we have an opportunity for Tad now to actually make minimum wage, in this case in the state of Oregon. And the delivery work that Tad has been doing, it was from right up front. The individual, Tad or his peers, if they get a job now, they are hired in at minimum wage or higher, and depending on the person and depending on the company or the store or whatever the effort. So at least minimum wage in the state of Oregon, that was $11.25 an hour. So all of a sudden his paychecks jumped to over $100 at a time, and now he's a taxpayer. So we think that what you're talking about is in this VRN service that was held earlier in Oregon that we were invited to, and Tad was invited to do a presentation there. And for Tad to be on stage for 5 minutes is a long time. This presentation was an hour by a panel, and Tad was able to be on and off stage, go out into the audience, greet people, stayed there, enjoyed the whole program for the solid hour. This is something that would be unheard of, say, a few years back, for Tad to actually participate in a group setting without wanting to just leave. And we've seen in a couple of other examples where he's been able to sit through meetings with large groups and participate perfectly in appropriate fashions. And we think this has, we think the more that Tad gets out into the community, the more he's involved with everybody, that it's changing his behavior to the good, actually.
One of the things that stuck with me the most is we had a provider, and I won't name names, but we had a provider who had done sheltered work for a very long time, and I was not sure they were going to transform. They'd actually talked about, if you take our federal funds, our Medicaid dollars, our state funds, we'll still just do this. It was actually one person at their sheltered workshop who'd been there for 20 years, who had pretty significant disabilities, who got a job at Cabela's. Huge outdoors guy, loved to hunt and fish and be outside, loved this job, and his entire life changed. We were talking earlier about people who might have more intensive behavior needs. This individual was always told you could only be in a sheltered workshop because he was one-on-one, he had a pretty intensive plan, sometimes he would just leave without telling anybody where he was going, didn't necessarily have safety skills if he was gone. He didn't have any of that happen at Cabela's because he loved to be there. And so he had natural supports. He, loved what he was doing. He doesn't even have a behavior support plan in that location anymore. Some on-the-job supports, but nothing like that. And the provider I worked for, knowing this person for so long, or worked with, she'd known this young man for a very long time. And one day I went to one of her board meetings and I was a little nervous. Usually they don't go very well for me. And she stood up and she said, I'm 75 years old. I've been doing this as long as I can remember. If I can change my mind, you can change your mind too. Basically saying that she believed in the transformation because of the way she'd seen it change somebody's life. And she said that sometimes we fight just because we're advocates and we think we have to fight. But sometimes good things are happening and we need to get on board instead of fight it. And so I cried during that one, which is rare, but it was a huge success, not only for this young man, but for this is not just a provider, this is like a family run provider, and their heart is really in it. And so it was a really big turning point. I'd say we probably need to talk for a long time because there's a lot of things that I thought we did really well and a lot of things that have been really hard that we could have done differently. I think a lot about, we've started having family forums probably about 2 years ago. I would have started having family forums in 2014, 2013. That would have been the first conversation. Being planful with the people you're serving and the families and the provider community. We did the best we could with the pressures we had, but I think that would have made a really big difference in terms of our outcomes. If people don't feel like it's happening to them at that point, they feel like they can be part of it. Finding successes has been incredibly helpful, like I just shared, and being able to share those successes so that people can see that it's possible. And I think working with your provider community. And I know sometimes people get frustrated by that. In Oregon, we have a very active, very engaged provider community, but they're the ones who are on the ground doing the work, hiring and retaining employees, and they really have to be on board. And so having that transformation grant has really changed our outcomes, I think, and it's part of why I know changing the sub-minimum wage law wouldn't necessarily be the same type of grant, but having any kind of temporary assistance that can help people make these changes, I think, is so critical.